Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The time is now 3:05 p.m. It's Wednesday, the 17th of June, and session 2, part 4 of this compulsory acquisition hearing is now open. And this afternoon's session will be looking at Surrey County Council's non-special category land matters. My name is Gavin Jones, and I'm the lead member of the panel of examining inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State for the application made by Highways England for an order granting development consent for the M25 Junction 10A3 Wisley Interchange project. I shall now let the other member of the panel introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Graham Gould and I'm the other panel member.
Most, if not quite all of you, but the vast majority of you were either here this morning or with the sessions yesterday, so I should keep this presentation quite brief. I think I shall just get Mr. Humphreys probably will run with you introducing yourself again, and just people from Highways England introducing themselves as and when required, I think is probably the easiest way of doing that. So Mr. Humphreys, if you'd just like to introduce yourself and confirm that you're okay to hear us still.
Yes, sir. It's Michael Humphreys again for Highways England, and there are a number of additional Highways England people who've joined, and as you suggest, we'll get them to introduce themselves as and when they speak. Thank you,
Mr. Humphreys. Now, in terms of Surrey County Council, again, I probably won't get all of you to introduce yourself. We did hear from various people earlier on today. Maybe just would the person who we should go to in the first instance with questions, maybe could you introduce yourselves to us, please?
Thank you, sir. My name is David Stemp for Surrey County Council, Major Schemes Team Leader. I'll be the lead officer talking for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stempfer. I see you've got your hand up. Okay, it's down again now. That's good. For those who haven't attended a session yet, if you do wish to grab our attention, then if you go to the toolbar, you'll see a raise your hand icon. That is probably the best way of getting our attention rather than trying to talk over people. And then when you've finished, if you can lower your hand using the same icon, that would be most appreciated. Thank you. Okay, I don't think I have too much else to say. Most of us are familiar with the virtual process by now, in which case I think I shall hand over to Mr. Gould for agenda item 2.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. So yes, agenda item 2 asks for Surrey County Council to summarise. We've got in the agenda objection. I think we'll use case because I'm not sure that you necessarily object to any particular land parcels for either compulsory acquisition or temporary possession. But no doubt that will become clear as to whether there are any particular plots to which you have an objection. But we'd ask you to make your submissions having regard to the legislation and the policy tests for compulsory acquisition. We'd ask you to make your summary in not more than 15 minutes, remembering, of course, that we dealt with special category land this morning. The one caveat in that is that in terms of Ockenbite's car park and any issues that you have there, although that's within the special category land area, we purposely decided this morning to keep the Ockenbite's car park out of that broader discussion about special category land. So any issues that you wish to raise about Ockenbite, this is the time to do it. And without any further ado, I presume I'm handing over to Mr. Stempfer.
Thank you, sir. David Stemp for Surrey County Council. I'd like to set out, as you say, it's more issues rather than objections. So thank you for the opportunity to set out the Council's views regarding the compulsory acquisition and temporary possession powers sought by Highways England. In the Council's Deadline 9 submission, we've raised 5 areas for discussion at today's hearing. These were in relation to, number 1, Ockenbite's car park, Number 2, permanent rights for access. Number 3, designation of land acquisition in relation to environmental mitigation and enhancement. Number 4, queries around land acquisition at Ockham Roundabout. And finally, maintenance access and land required for visibility. I'm pleased to report that through ongoing positive collaborative dialogue between ourselves and Highways England, there's recently been significant progress on a number of the council's issues since we raised them. So I'd like to outline the issues raised by the council, along with highlighting areas where issues have either been resolved or are actively working together to achieve a resolution. In many cases, these resolutions require appropriate confirmation within the relevant legal side agreements that are currently in develop between the two parties. So firstly, if I can turn to Ockham Bites car park and cafe. Part of the Ockham Bites car park is within the DCO red line boundary, but these only cover part of the car park, and therefore the council has concerns regarding the impact on the residual area that we believe should have been either included in the DCO red line or dealt with through accommodation works. In recent days, Highways England have advised that a draft Ockham Bites legal side agreement has been produced, broadly based upon the scope of works the council set out in the last set of written questions. We welcome this approach and will continue to work collaboratively with Highways England to agree and sign a final version before the close of the examination. This will, however, involve some further discussion and investigation regarding permissions required for the works. We're currently looking as to whether planning permission is required for the works. However, had this area been included within the DCO red line boundary, this would not have been necessary. So we'd ask on this item that the hearing note that Highways England have agreed to enter into this agreement and to design and deliver these accommodation works. If I can now move on to the second area, which is in relation to permanent rights for access, and particularly the NMU route. The council has consistently argued that the NMU route beside the A3 should be considered as a replacement facility and the future maintenance burden should not fall to the county council. It has, however, recently been confirmed by Highways England that they are willing to provide commuted sums to the council for this element, excluding the short section on road section along Seven Hills Road. Again, we welcome this confirmation and will continue to work with Highways England to ensure that this confirmation is now included and enshrined in the legal highway side agreement that the parties are working to, agreeing during the examination period. The council's views are these commuted sums should also cover any supporting earthworks for the NMU route, such as around Cockrow Bridge embankments and other areas of embankments. So again, we would ask that the hearing note that Highways England have agreed to provide these commuted sums and include these in the legal highway side agreement. The council's submission also raised broader issues regarding the scope of the applicant's permanent rights for access around other areas, and these can really be summarised as three main areas. There is a section of Elm Lane where it meets the A3 that is shown as temporary acquisition with permanent rights. Highways England has subsequently confirmed that these rights of access are for the diverted gas main in this area, but we would ask if the applicant would also provide commuted sums for the maintenance of this section of road. Secondly, there's a ditch on the western side of the Wisley Lane overbridge, again shown as temporary acquisition with permanent rights. So we would ask whether this means that Highways England will either maintain this ditch or provide commuted sums to the authority. Finally, in relation, there's various accesses to soakaways and drainage ponds along the route, such as that on the north side of Cockrow Bridge. These accesses are outside of the NMU route, so we'd ask if Highways England can provide clarity that either they will carry out and fund any repairs on these routes, or that these will be included within the commuted sums they've agreed to for the NMU route. I can move on to my third point. The third area of concern for the council was the issue of permanent rights remaining over land subject to temporary possession that will be subject to a time-limited maintenance period. This covers the special protection enhancement areas. In recent days, Highways England has suggested that the legal environmental side agreement should set out that these rights should be extinguished at the appropriate point in the future when no longer required. We welcome this, and this again addresses the council's concerns around plots being encumbered by permanent rights in the future when no longer necessary. This side agreement also includes for a steering group to be set up between the County Council, Surrey Wildlife Trust and Highways England, so there is a mechanism there to agree when those rights should be extinguished. My fourth area is around land acquisition at the Ockham Roundabout. The council have raised queries as to why permanent title acquisition is required for land plots at the Ockham roundabout that form part of the council's highway network, and there's also land owned by Highways England that forms part of the council's highway. The council's highway rights cannot be purchased as they're a legal status, so regardless as to whether Highways England acquire the freehold of the land, the surface will remain vested in the county council as highway authority until such time as the highway rights are stopped up or the highway ceases to be maintainable at public expense by the county council, neither of which are proposed for the plots in question. It is understood that it's standard practice for Highways England to include the land it already owns within the compulsory acquisition powers as a precautionary approach to ensure that no known or unknown third-party rights remain over the land, which could potentially impede delivery of the scheme. However, the council would seek just some quick clarification on this, particularly as plots 1/31 is shown as temporary possession, and there appears to be inconsistency with the temporary and permanent acquisition where the situation is the same. For example, plots 1/14 and 1/16. However, I'd say this is the council really just seeking some clarification on this matter. Finally, in respect of land in relation to maintenance access, visibility displays and the realigned Wisley Lane, there are areas where the council will require title acquisition in order to carry out future maintenance activities without future impediment for works and assets that are passing to the county council. The council are currently in discussion with Highways England over this issue. On the 27th of May, Highways England provided the council with a schedule and plans relating to draft proposals for maintenance access, to which the council has responded with a short report regarding areas of concern. Such areas of concern require title access and maintenance access to the abutments and soffit of the Wisley Lane Stratford Brook Bridge. We believe that there's space within the red line boundary to provide this, but the access track has not been shown, and suitable access to the faces of the retaining walls on the A245. The council is still currently awaiting a detailed schedule of assets that Highways England require the council to take on and maintain, including around the Wisley Lane. Highways England have confirmed that this will be provided, and essentially what the authority is seeking is not just broad areas on plans, but the specific asset, because each will have a different cost to maintain. For example, vehicle restraint barrier, drainage ditches, square area of surfacing, etc. The council did have concerns regarding land required in respect of visibility displays, and some of these were set out in the council's response to the third set of written questions, question 3.13.5. However, both parties are currently actively working collaboratively to resolve these issues and have met recently to discuss this. The main remaining area are around the Paynes Hill Junction, where we're seeking to develop solutions to the issues. Finally, the council note that Highways England wishes the county council to adopt and maintain the realigned Wisley Lane. In addition to the commuted sums of maintenance the council would require for this, it would also require title to pass to the council for this new road. So in summary, the remaining issues are the Ockham Bites legal side agreement being finalised. Secondly, agreeing the specific list of assets for which Highways England will provide commuted sums and confirming this in the legal side agreement, which will also include clarity regarding maintenance around Elm Lane, the drainage ditch on the west side of Wisley Lane, and the access tracks to the ponds and soakaways. Thirdly, confirming the extinguishment of rights of the SPA and replacement land is set out in the legal environmental side agreement. Fourthly, clarification on the title acquisition status around Ockham roundabout. Fifthly, confirmation of title passing to the council for access widths and tracks for maintenance purposes, so the county council can maintain these areas without any future encumbrance, and the rear title of the rear lane Wisley Lane, and finally resolving the remaining forward visibility issues at the Paynes Hill Junction. Thank you, sir, and that concludes Surrey County Council's case and update.
Thank you, Mr. Stempfer. It goes without saying, and I suspect you've just read from a pre-prepared note that post the close of the hearing, that note will need to be submitted to us as an examination document. I think without much ado, if Mr. Humphreys is ready, we're able to go to agenda item 3, which is the applicant's response to Surrey County Council's not objections but observations, and the remaining areas that require further attention. Let's put it that way.
So certainly, and I'll turn my camera off just so that I don't get problems halfway through. But hopefully you can still hear me. And so the first thing to note, and I'm grateful to Mr. Stemfer for setting out these various things, is that there has been really quite intense engagement between Highways England and the County Council. I'm very grateful to the County Council for all the work they've put into this, and an awful lot of progress. There are some matters where, you know, we are still negotiating things and discussing them, but a lot of progress has been made. So I'm also conscious that that the 5 points that Mr. Stemfer very helpfully set out quite closely reflect the 4 points that you have at agenda item 4 in your agenda. Not completely, but fairly closely. And so what I'll do is touch lightly at this stage on the 4 issues, and then you may want to pick them up again at agenda item 4. What I will also
Mr.
say
Humphreys, sorry to interject, if it's easier for you to give the applicant's fuller position on those rather than us raise questions, then I think that would be appropriate to do, because the questions that we had were based upon what we saw at the last deadline. It sounds like things have probably moved on a bit since the last deadline. Yes. So those questions might be a bit out of date anyway. Or have you prepared your note on the basis that we would be asking questions?
No, sir, not at all. I'm perfectly flexible to deal with it however you would find it most helpful. What I will say is that I've got 3 other witnesses on the call. Jacqueline Watson, Robert Marks, and Jacqueline Watson's been involved in a lot of the matters, including, for example, you know, Ockenbites and so on. Robert Marks, who's been very much involved in a lot of the technical matters, visibility displays, highway design, that sort of thing, and obviously Mr. Chalice, indeed also Mr. Spencer, Oliver Spencer, who've been involved in some of the negotiations. So what I'll probably do is briefly deal with these things and then see if they want to add anything. But just going through the points then in the order that Mr. Stemfer did, and he started with Ockenbites car park. Absolutely correct. There is has been a lot of discussion there, and it's right that there is a loss of probably about a third of the capacity of the car park. The cafe can remain operational, but it is then between what would be the new embankment and the A3. But what we've been talking to the County Council about is a series of accommodation works. We can't reduce, I should say, the height of the embankment, which is work number 35. It obviously leads to the overbridge, but we are in the side agreement talking about various works to maintain a sort of certain minimum capacity of the car park, to retain a woodland buffer, retain certain trees and vegetations, resurfacing, for example, suitable access and so on. And I think subject to anything that the rest of the Highways England team want to add, those things are probably best left to the discussions. But what I can confirm to you is that we've had very positive engagement, and things are very definitely moving in the right direction towards these things being included in a side agreement. I'll just see whether any of the others, possibly Jackie Watson, wants to add anything there. I can see her video image has appeared, so I'll just turn off my mic for a moment.
Yes, good afternoon, Jacqueline Watson, Atkins for the applicant. I think that's a very good summary Mr. Humphreys has just given. That is my understanding of the matter, having been responsible for coordinating the work on the SOCD between Highways England and Surrey County Council, which you will see summarised at item 9.1.1 of the Statement of Common Ground, which is document Rep 8030. As to the point about the horizontal and vertical alignment of the embankment, the examining authority might find it helpful to look at the longitudinal profile, which can be found in the volume 2.9 engineering drawings and sections. I think it appears as sheet 20 in Rep 8011, the latest version of that, and that will show the height of the embankment relative to the overbridge across the A3, so you'll be able to see the constraint and the need to reach that height. The applicant has responded to Surrey County Council's queries about the horizontal alignment and about possibly realigning that embankment to the other side of the cafe, and has explained that in its documents Rep 2047, which was the response to the written representations, and in, Rep 2014, the response to representations, and Rep 2047, the LIR, which is the response provided in Rep 3007, basically to say that we need to provide vehicle access across the overbridge there, and therefore, in order to achieve the relevant radii for vehicles crossing over that bridge, it's not possible to realign the embankment away from alongside the A3. But in all other regards, and as so far as is practicable, we are working towards a side agreement, making provision to address the scope of work in Surrey's deadline 10 submission.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. I think that sounds like Mrs. Watson has finished on Ockham Bites. I don't know whether you've got anything further to add, or whether you want to go on to point 2.
I note, sir, that Mr. Stemfer has raised his virtual hand.
Mr. Stemfer, is it a quick point, or is this something that we should return to once we've heard everything that the applicant is going to say in effect in its summary position? Mr. Stemfer?
Thank you, sir. David Stemfer, Surrey County. Yes, so we can return to it afterwards. There's a couple of points I wanted to make in respect of Ockham Roundabout, Ockham Bites. I can either make it at the end of this session or respond to each point as we cover it. Thank you.
I think it's going to be easy if we can let Mr. Humphreys go through, and the rest of the applicant team, the 5 points, and then we'll come back to it either in the question session or depending on whether or not we do have a question session, but we'll deal with it in effect under agenda item 4, or it can be something that might be dealt with in your final right of reply. So, Mr. Humphreys.
So, thank you. It's Michael Humphreys once again. I think the second area that Mr. Stemper touched on was certain permanent rights, and this is kind of a basket of different issues, but one of the principal issues here relates to the long NMU, and you'll note that in some of Surrey County Council's earlier submissions, they asked that we take permanent rights of for maintenance over assets of that sort, the long NMU being an example, and perhaps the most obvious of them, and that we then maintain those particular new features. And our position has been on that we don't think we should make provision for us acquiring those permanent rights and us permanently maintaining them. Once in a sense the scheme development itself is over, these things return to the county. So the discussion has, as Mr. Samper pointed out, then moved on to us making some form of contribution towards those things, and the current proposal is that we are negotiating with them to make a contribution, sometimes called a commuted payment, in a side agreement for certain types of what I suppose you could call kind of non-standard assets, things where, as a result of our project, there are new permanent features which impose a particular burden on the county outside what it might otherwise expect to carry. And so again, you know, I think the principle of that is understood and accepted. Obviously, there is a discussion being had as to the precise what falls within the scope of that, and what level any contribution or commuted payment should be made at. But again, those are you know, very helpful discussions that we're having with the county, and I'm sort of kind of reluctant to sort of intrude too much on the detail of that. Again, Jackie Watson, I think, has been involved in that, so I'll just see if she would like to add anything to that overview that I've just given.
Jacqueline Watson, there isn't anything really to add to that. Thank you, sir. I think at this point there are, as Mr. Humphreys explained, there were a basket of items which fall into this general bracket about the categorisation of land. So Surrey County Council's position was querying whether the DCO should have made provision for acquisition of rights along the NMU and its supporting structures to enable Highways England to carry out the maintenance of that work. But as Mr. Humphreys has explained, that's now subject to negotiations in a separate highway agreement. There was a few other points which were made in the case for Surrey relating to the Wisley Lane diversion, and we believe that there's no further disagreement between Surrey and Highways England on the categorisation of that land for the purposes of the land plans. Where there are other points about the categorisation, they relate primarily to the SPA compensation and enhancement areas. The queries about taking freehold over parts of Surrey's network, such as the Ockham roundabout, and whether the freehold should be acquired in certain plots for maintenance. But I think we'll probably come on to those points elsewhere on the agenda.
Yes, and Ms. Watson, unfortunately, you're breaking up a little bit. What you might have to do when you speak again is possibly only go to audio and switch the video camera off, and that might improve things.
Fair, thank you. I will do that.
Mr. Humphreys, I think we're moving on to the third item in the list.
Yeah, the third item, again, a slightly different point. This relates to plots of land which are subject to temporary possession powers, but where we're also taking certain permanent rights to undertake long-term maintenance, and this relates, for example, to areas where we have long-term obligations under the LEMP, sometimes extending for periods, like 20 years and so on. And our view is that it's inappropriate to take temporary possession powers for such a long period, and so we've taken rights. Rights are typically permanent rights, but we recognize that there will come a time, because the rights are tied to a particular activity, in relation to, for example, the LEMP, there will come a time when the obligations under the LEMP or whatever other obligation it is will have finished, and theoretically the right will still be there, but the right at that point will be what lawyers sometimes call spent. It's a right to do something, but the something no longer exists, so it becomes an empty right. And what we've said in the discussions with Surrey County Council is that we have no problem in the side agreement in agreeing, giving an obligation that when those permanent rights become spent because the thing that the right is there for no longer exists, for example, maintenance under the LEMP, that we will remove the right from the land title. And so at that point, the title won't be encumbered with a spent right. So for non-lawyers, that probably sounds all a bit arcane. Actually, even for lawyers, it sounds a little bit arcane. But we've had a very positive discussion with Surrey on this. I think they're now quite comfortable with that position. So it's our proposal that our obligation will find its way into the side agreement, so that these rights will ultimately be removed by us by agreement. So I think that was number 3, sir. I would be surprised if anyone else wants to add anything to that, but who knows. I'll take that as a no and move on to then item 4. So an item 4 was, I think, possibly, unless I kind of slightly misheard it, the point that Ms. Watson was just touching on there, which is land acquisition around the Ockham roundabout. This is some plots that are where the freehold ownership is with Surrey County Council, therefore works that we will carry out in connection with the Wisley Lane diversion, which will obviously end up being a Surrey County Council road. And the point there is simply, well, hang on, why are we including their title in our compulsory acquisition when it's ultimately going to go back to them and be their road? And I think Mr. Stanford very properly put his finger right on the point when he said it is Highways England's practice, and indeed, in fairness, not just Highways England, but developers under DCOs generally, to include land within their DCOs in order to what is sometimes called clean the title. In other words, if some other right that we're not aware of appeared and asserted itself, then we would be able to either acquire it if it was an interest, or extinguish it if it was some sort of third-party easement or something else. And so it's for that purpose. And so I think, again, you know, it would not be our intention to compulsorily acquire the freehold from Surrey and then give the freehold back to Surrey along with the road at a later date. And again, that's something that we are discussing with them, and I have no doubt that we'll be able to come to a satisfactory arrangement on that. So again, I'll just see whether anyone else wants to add anything on that one, but I suspect not. I'm less confident than with the last one, but I suspect not. So I'll come to the final one where you know, it may be that Jackie Watson or indeed Robert Marks want to say something. This relates to, again, a sort of basket of different things. If I've understood Mr. Sanford's point correctly, there are some things which are to do with Surrey County Council getting access to some of their retained land and assets, and some points which relate to sort of highway design and things like visibility, the sort of issue that arose at Elm Lane and Old Lane, but also that have arisen, as you will have seen in the various submissions, in relation to the Paynes Hill junction. And I think there the position is that you know, we are discussing these sort of technical issues. We are confident that there is a solution to all of the points that have been raised, and I think we've had very good engagement with the council on that. But I'll just see there whether there's anyone else from the Highways England team that just wants to add any detail to that. So I'll just turn my mic off. I'm not sure whether this one would be Ms. Watson, or it may even be Mr. Bown on this one, as we're dealing more with design, or indeed Mr. Mark. So I'll just turn my mic off and see if they want to add anything.
So it's Jacqueline Watson speaking. And so for Highways England, Mr. Humphreys is correct. In terms of the issues made by Surrey, presented by Surrey, they are matters of detail between the parties and subject to further negotiation. We are confident that there is sufficient space within the DCO boundary to provide for the maintenance requirements of the scheme. Surrey has raised a number of particular queries relating to structures and bridges. Mr. Marks is available if there are specific queries on the detail of those, but as a general principle, we're confident that that can be accommodated and either agreed through the detailed design, or agreed, a position agreed and confirmed in a final statement of common ground by deadline 12.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Is there anything else, Mr. Humphreys, or anybody from the rest of the team that from the applicant side, that feels they need to add anything for any of the 5 points?
So there's nothing that I'll just turn my video off again just to.
I think you're all right. You're pretty good at the moment.
Oh, all right.
We've got less demand on the system, I suspect, at this time of day.
Possibly. So I don't think so. I'm not aware of any other points we need to make. I'll just sort of look at my notes and see if there's anything there, but I don't think so. So I think we're fine. And as I say, a number of the points arise later in the agenda, so it may be that if anyone does want to add anything, they'll get a second shot at it.
Fine. I think then we will go back to the points that Mr. Stempfer wanted to raise a little while ago, because it might be whatever he now wishes to say might address the questions and whether or not we need to raise the questions. So, Mr. Stempfer.
Thank you, sir. David Stempfer, Surrey County Council. Yeah, firstly, if I can turn to Ockham Bites, I think obviously there is a mechanism through the side agreement to deal with those accommodation works. I think the County Council's concerns on those is, should planning permission be required or other permissions, then there's not additional work that Surrey County Council has to do, small amounts of expense, but potential objections, I guess, to that. So I think that's why we were slightly puzzled as to why the DCO hadn't included the whole of Ockham Bites within the design. Currently, on the Ockham Bites car park, the public have the ability to park in the car park and walk over level ground to access the common to the south of Cockrow Bridge. And obviously, New World, they'll be faced with an embankment to negotiate. And we thought another advantage of having Ockham Bites within the red line boundary meant that some of the embankment could perhaps be redesigned or smoothed out into the area to improve that access. So although positive that we're moving forward with a side agreement, perhaps it might be worth exploring, is it too late for that to be included in the red line boundary, because it then becomes incumbent on a further planning permission, and in the current agreement it's proposed that would be for the County Council to progress. Thank you.
So I think the reality is that it would take a fairly major redesign of the scheme to move that that embankment, which has been a feature which has been in the scheme obviously for a long time. And at this stage in the examination, my view is that there is no, I'm afraid, realistic possibility of us changing the red line boundary in order to undertake those works, which themselves would need a lot of additional design. We have acknowledged, I hope anyway, you would feel the the issues that have been raised at Ockham Bites, and as I say, we've had really good discussions with Surrey County Council on this, but we think the right way forward is the side agreement and the various measures that we're discussing with the County Council in relation to that, and I can't see therefore that we will be changing the design or the red line boundary. There's simply not the time or the opportunity to do that at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. I suspect we are actually now moving into agenda item 4. There are a couple of questions I think that sprung to mind about Ockham Bites, given what we've heard this afternoon. And underlying that, I know we dealt with special category land earlier, but I suppose there is a nagging doubt that's just certainly come to me this afternoon in this second session, is that the examining authority and ultimately the Secretary of State, in a situation where the Secretary of State is minded to grant the the development consent order needs to be certain, I think, that there would be no significant disadvantage because of the reconfiguration of the car park to accommodate the embankment to the public right of way, such that users of the special category land, whether they be common land users or users of the open space, would be disadvantaged, and therefore we get into a situation under section 31(1) of the Act that creates a bit of a difficulty. And of course, with a side agreement, which the examining authority is not going to see, we will presumably get an update by deadline 12 at the absolute latest that either it has been signed or it's in the process of being signed. But I think there is a concern that the examining authority needs to take on board to make sure there is a mechanism and that we can report there's a mechanism that isn't going to cause disadvantage, because for whatever reason, negotiations fall apart at the end. And there is then this unresolved issue as to how that car park might function, given that it's probably quite important to visitors to the special category land, not least because the survey that we talked about that the applicant undertook, I think in September 2017, which I presume is a survey that you're going away to look at to see whether or not you can submit some sort of details to us as an examination document, has highlighted that a lot of visitors to the special category land do come by car, and they potentially need to park somewhere, either at Ockham Bites or one of the other car parks that's available to visitors. That was quite convoluted, but hopefully either you, Mr. Humphreys, or somebody else from the team can possibly give the examining authority some comfort as to how things might pan out in that context.
Yes, sir. I don't know whether Mr. Price, Richard Price, is able to bring up any of the scheme layout plans. It might be just useful to have a look at those. I apologise, I've not got the library reference number, but they were one of the documents, I think, on your lists, possibly for today, but certainly for, yes, they are. So it's Rep 8009, and if he was able to bring up sheet 4, we could just have a look at that area and discuss it, and then, you know, it may be that I can ask Ms. Watson or indeed others to comment as well, if that's going to be possible.
Okay, for the benefit of everybody that can see the screen, I'm going to request control from Mr. Price, and I can then point out the embankment, and hopefully, Mr. Humphreys, you or somebody else from the team can then talk around the point.
Yes, so you can see there, sort of in the centre of the site. You'll be able to point it out where
hopefully people can see the arrow.
Yeah, where the Ockham Bites car park is, and you can see that embankment that goes up there to the Cockcrow Bridge, which goes over the A3. And you can see marked there in the sort of darker colour. It's kind of looks a bit bluey purpley to me, but it's probably something different in the original. The NMU, or part of the NMU, and it's not, you can't see it quite so well on this plan, which I think may be one of these, as you call them, condensed plans. But there's towards when that NMU goes down towards Old Lane, and you can see there there's a little sort of spur off that goes towards the car park, and that's actually work 35D. The spur goes both ways, so it gives access from the car park onto the NMU, and indeed it also goes the the other way as well. And so you can see the car park, of course. So I understand that the car park has an embankment there, but you can see it's very easy to get from the car park onto the NMU, and when onto the NMU you actually rise up on that embankment and then pass over to the wider network to the north, and indeed in fact it's the west, but the higher part of the plan as we're looking at it, and on the eastern side of the highway there, it more widely. And so Mr. Semper's right to point to that feature being there, but I don't think it's fair to characterize that as in some way being a bar. As to the more sort of wider point about the number of spaces, I think you went on your site visit to the Ockenbites car park and the little cafe there. The kind of layout of that area is, should we say, fairly informal and perhaps not the most efficient. And I think one of the things that we're discussing with the county council is kind of opportunities to sort of improve the design of that area so that it maintains an acceptable level of or number of spaces. So we believe that, although obviously, as you can see on the plan, there is an effect on the car park, we think it remains a really good facility, which will be really good in giving access to the wider both common open space and indeed SPA. I'll just see if other members of the team want to add anything there, but I think it's, as I say, it's quite useful to see this on the plan to see what is actually proposed, which I hope is more reassuring to you.
Yes, and yet again, Mr. Humphreys, with alarming repetition, you've guessed at the plan that we might have talked to when we were going through the questions. This is getting concerning.
Well, so I obviously will be appearing at the London Palladium soon as part of my Mind Act, where I do this with inspectors. But look, I'm really pleased. Obviously, in a sense that's helpful. It's an obvious plan, and that's useful. Can I just see if anyone else wants to comment? As I say, I have not been at all close to these negotiations, and others have, so they may want to add something.
Hello, this is Robert Marks representing Highways England. I'd just like to point out the access between Old Lane and the bottom where the embankment starts to rise. You can see that blue coloured area, which is a drainage facility. That level there between there and the Old Lane is a very shallow embankment, less than 300 millimetres. So it'd be easy for pedestrians to walk across the NMU route and gain access to the common at that point. And from that point, the NMU route rises at the maximum gradient permitted of 5%. From where the point GG is noted on the plan, approximately. Oh, it's moving.
That's because that's showing me moving the cursor. That's all. Okay,
it's where the blue drainage facility is, slightly to the left. About from that point, the gradient rises to 5%, which is a maximum gradient, so we cannot reduce it to less than that. And it's rising towards Curry's Clump, which is a natural feature. So it's so I just want to point out that there's fairly easy access from the main car park across to Ockham Common on the south side.
So if I may come in, Jacqueline Watson for the applicant. Again, you can see from the longitudinal section in the engineering drawings and sections for the new Curry's Clump bridleway, which is sheet 20 of 25 in the longitudinal profiles of volume 2.9, which is the latest version is Rep 8011, and you'll be able to see that actually at present there is quite a change in ground levels between the entrance to the car park and climbing up to Curry's Clump. But to add that, really, as Mr. Humphreys explained, the car parking there is somewhat informally laid out. It's not a sort of marked bays, and the primary purpose of the side agreement is to look at the remaining area to see whether through configuring the design more efficient use could be made of the space which is available to compensate and therefore get a compensatory number of spaces retained on the site. And that is the primary purpose of what the agreement is about.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Mr. Ty, I've seen your hand up, so don't worry, we won't forget you. But I do want to come back to the point I raised, or ask a slightly supplemental question. In terms of this particular side agreement, where are you in terms of getting it concluded on a timeline?
So I think on that it may be either Mr. Chalice or Mr. Spencer can say. It is certainly our very firm intention to get it concluded well before the end of the examination, but I'm not party to those negotiations, so it may be that someone else who is can comment on that. I imagine also Mr. Semfer, that's the county's intention as well. We're all aware, you reminded us yesterday of the deadlines and the need to get things in. We're all working towards that. So let me just, as I say, there's nothing I can add on that, but let's just see if anyone else can.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. Mark Chalice for Highways England. We are discussing the draft, as Mr. Humphreys has said. Originally in the side agreement, that's the highways agreement, which has been discussed earlier, we were going to set out the headings and agree to settle the agreement in accordance with the headings as soon as we could. But in fact, we've now circulated, and I appreciate the council have only just got this a full version of the agreement. And if we can conclude it before the end of the examination, then we'll do that.
I mean, if this is a freestanding agreement, I think it's probably going to give the examining authority a lot more comfort that there is a resolution that will ensure there's no disadvantage, or there's a minimised disadvantage to users of the special category land. If that one can be accelerated and we can be informed that it has been concluded by close.
Indeed, Sir. Mark Chalice for Highways England. The intention is there will be a binding arrangement in place, whether in outline or in detail, according to the timetable we've just mentioned. So there is sufficient certainty on the matter.
Thank you. Mr. Ty, you've had your hand up for a little while. If any points haven't been covered that you wish to raise, can you now do so, please?
Michael Ty, Surrey County Council. Two areas of concern. Firstly, we are uncertain whether the redesign of the car park will require planning permission, and if it does turn out that it needs planning permission, firstly we would like Highways England to make that application on our behalf. But secondly, if they do make that application, or even if Surrey make that application, if it is refused, then we will be disadvantaged, and so will the users of the special category land. So that does raise some concern, because we don't think, well, we almost certainly will not meet the deadlines if planning permission is required. It is of course possible that planning permission isn't required for the redesign of that car park, but we think that should be incumbent on Highways England to do those necessary diligence on those matters. I think the second point is observational, that I'm informed that the users of the special category land actually cross from that car park on the northeastern corner onto the heathland. So that's the point where the embankment is at its highest. So there is somewhat of a disadvantage to the users of that car park. And it does happen to be the key car park, simply because there's a cafe there and it's a good area for visitors to start and finish their journeys around the heathland.
Mr. Ty, when we've heard talk about the reconfiguration of the car park, is that actually hard surfacing it, tarmacking it, so that you can formally lay out car park spaces to get more people in because they'd be following a formal pattern, or is it some other form of reconfiguration?
We are open to any suggestion that is made. Clearly, if you hard surface it, you can line it more effectively. But I have seen other car parks which haven't been surfaced, which are adequately bays marked. So there will be ways around it. We aren't insisting that that car park is resurfaced. So there is a hope that planning permission isn't required, but we would like confirmation from Highways England, who first need to speak to the local planning authority.
So, if I may, Mark Challis for Highways England, that is one of the issues under discussion as to whether planning permission is likely to be forthcoming or not. To make the obvious point, if the works are appropriate, there would seem to be no particular reason why planning permission wouldn't follow, but that's something that's being discussed as part of our negotiation on the side agreement.
So, sorry, Mr. Chair, just so I'm clear, is it Highways England that's in direct negotiation, I presume with Guildford Borough, with Surrey also involved in those discussions to try and bottom out whether or not whatever is being proposed would or will not need planning permission?
Mark Challis for Highways England. So at the moment, our position is it will be easier and more appropriate for Surrey County Council to get planning permission, and Highways England, as it will have its workforce and machinery on the site in connection with the works, to do the works. So if there is disagreement on that, we need to resolve that. But our view, I think, is that it will be more appropriate for Surrey to get planning permission than for us. But of course, we can discuss and hopefully resolve that.
Sir Michael Ty, sorry to talk over. That is something that we will need to agree, but we are minded that we believe Highways England are the best people to obtain planning permission for this. That will be our position, but we can discuss that clearly with Highways England.
Thank you, Mr. Ty. So it sounds like it's either going to be Surrey County Council applying to itself as a Reg 3, or Highways England applying to Guildford Borough as a, inverted commas, more customary planning application.
That is correct, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions that might have been asked, but I think we've dealt with a lot of the Occambyte type questions already. I think all the examining authority can say at this point, without wishing to repeat or be repeating the same point, I think we certainly, as the examining authority, do need some clarity pretty quickly as to what the position is, so that we can address the special category land issue that I think is arising out of all this in reporting to the Secretary of State. And I think the best way of dealing with that is to leave it for an action for applicant and Surrey to try and get some sort of resolution so that you can both update us by deadline 11, hopefully, but certainly by deadline 12, because otherwise we will not know what the position is as we go into the reporting phase.
Thank you, sir. Mark Chalice for Highways England. We understand that, and we will, of course, provide the update that you have asked for.
Thank you, Mr. Chalice. Sorry, I was just checking over the questions that I had for Ockham Bites. I think we have covered everything. So I think what I will do is just, is there anything that either Surrey wishes to raise with us about Ockham Bites car park or the applicant before we move on? Surrey, anything further to add about Ockham Bites car park?
Thank you, sir. David Stemper, Surrey County Council. No, I think we've explored the subject. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the applicant, anything further?
No, sir, I don't think so.
Thank you very much. My next question, I think, has been dealt with because we've talked about the longevity of temporary possession and how that's being resolved. So I think that's all addressed. I think really my final question, and it's for Surrey County Council, is if the various agreements that have been talked about are not concluded by whatever date that might be, would the County Council have a specific objection to any of the proposed compulsory acquisition of its land plots? Mr. Stempfel or anybody else from the team?
David Stemp, thank you, sir. David Stemp for Surrey County Council. Could you please give me a moment just to consult with colleagues?
Yep,
Thank
of
you.
course. I mean, that might be something you cannot answer now because it might depend upon how negotiations are going to go over the next few weeks. But I think probably at the very latest, we'd like a heads up by deadline 11, and we must know by deadline 12 so that we can take account of what might be an objection to a particular plot or plots as we get into write-up.
Thank you, sir. David Stemp for Surrey County Council. Thank you. I think, yes, we'll put something in writing at deadline 11 and review our position.
Thank you.
I would like to raise one issue, if I can, around the NMU route that was discussed, if that's possible.
Of course.
So, as we said, there's a discussion around the County Council's previous position on the NMU route. Our positions really stem from the fact that as cycling was being banned on the A3 between the Ockham roundabout and Paynes Hill, and the A3 widened over an existing cycle facility, that the replacement cycle facility should be maintained by Highways England, and that was why we were asking the question around title or permanent rights. Subsequent to that, obviously, the offer of commuted sums has been suggested. I think in Mr. Humphrey's QC's points, he mentioned contribution. I think we'd see it rather as full commuted sum for the additional maintenance liability that would fall on the county council for that quite extensive NMU route and appropriate embankments. So if it were treated in that way, the county would be minded to take a different view over the NMU route. So that's a point of clarity, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen. I don't think I need to ask the applicant to respond to that unless the applicant feels a particular need, because there's obviously there's still discussions ongoing in the background. Mr. Jones, have you got any questions that have come to mind that you feel you need to raise at this point before I invite Surrey to make their final closing comments?
Just check my notes if I can, Mr. Gould. Won't be 1 minute. No, I don't think I've got any further questions. I'd just like to reinforce the point that I think we've got 3.5 weeks left of the examination. We've got 2 deadlines, the 3rd of July and I think the 10th of July off the top of my head, closing on Sunday the 12th of July. So I would just make the point that if we haven't been informed side agreements are in place, we don't necessarily need to see those, or the documents that need to be submitted and haven't been submitted. Anything submitted after the examination, we cannot take into account when we're writing up. I think I'll say that and leave it there, but no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Then really we come to agenda item 5, which is the opportunity for Surrey County Council in effect to have your final reply if you feel there's anything that you need to say on compulsory acquisition or temporary possession matters. Mr. Stemfer.
Thank you, sir. David Stemfer, Surrey County Council. I don't think there's a lot really want to raise anymore, really. We will submit at deadline 11 the note that I read to at the beginning of the document, and so we greatly welcome the positive and collaborative approach with the applicant and the two-way flow of information. As a side point, we would like to raise that the applicant hasn't entered into a PPA, planning performance agreement, with the county council, so although we're working collaboratively and more so than just a respondee to the DCO, we are incurring personal officer cost that we're not being recompensed for. But I think all of our issues are being dealt with. I think probably the one remaining issue around land is the Paint Hill visibility from the southbound off slip to the A245, where we believed it may have impacted on land outside of the red line boundary. We've had a very detailed meeting in recent weeks with Highways England, who are working up some alternative design options to demonstrate that the design standards can be met within the red line boundary. So I'd like to kind of end by thanking Highways England and their consultants for the positive and collaborative discussions we've had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stemfer. Mr. Jones, that then takes us to agenda item 6, so I'll hand over to yourself.
So
sorry, Mr. Humphreys. Yep.
Mention something, Mr. Gold. I know you'll have done this deliberately, but we passed over agenda item 3, and I suspect there is nothing more that I would say on that than indeed I said yesterday, but I just wanted to make sure, or for you to confirm, that you've passed over that deliberately.
Yes, because I think we're in a slightly different situation to the site-specific objections that we're hearing from other parties. Yes, and the comments you made yesterday in session 1 were of a high level. Surrey's interest, of course, is very different to all of the other affected persons for this examination, just because they've got so many land parcels that are affected. And also, I think we're in a slightly different situation with Surrey, in that they clearly don't have, at least at this stage, specific objections to particular proposals for acquisition or the use of temporary possession.
So I'm completely happy with that, completely comfortable. I just didn't want, because we went from Surrey's points straight into your questions, which kind of pretty much matched up, and therefore passed over. I didn't want you to miss something,
No,
but
no.
I had nothing very much to say for
Part of the reason why the agendas are compiled, particularly for those that are not, they're self-representing, it's often easier to get the applicant to do some of the heavy lift on the legislative side of things. But Surrey's a bit different. They are legally represented. So, yeah, we have a less of an issue in that respect. Right. Mr. Jones.
Okay, the shuffling of papers you might have heard indicates I'm ready to go on action points. So the first one I have is Surrey County Council to submit effectively its presentation to today's session as a post-hearing note, deadline 11, please. And then the next action point I have is for if matters aren't resolved, and clearly if planning permission is required, then you haven't got a chance of getting that before the close of the examination, but for the applicant and Surrey County Council to provide a final position statement on the Ockham Bites car park situation if matters aren't resolved. And for Surrey County Council, deadline 11, please, to put in writing what land plots it might object to if the various agreements aren't to be reached. Those are the three action points that I noted from this afternoon's session. I don't know if anybody else has anything in this true virtual world. Please speak up if you do.
No, sir, not from me.
Thank you, Mr. Stemp, for anything from Surrey County Council.
Thank you, sir. David Stemp for Surrey County Council. No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Okay, in which case I would like to first of all remind you of the examination timetable, the deadlines, deadline 11, Friday the 3rd of July. I believe we've covered all the items on the agenda today. Just before we close, though, I would like to thank, obviously we won't be seeing the representatives from Surrey County Council again, as far as I'm aware. I don't think you're scheduled for the two sessions tomorrow with the RHS and WPIL, in which case I would just like to thank you all for all the hard work you've put in, both you know, in the world that in the normal world pre-pandemic, and also in this virtual post-pandemic world. You know, Surrey County Council has really taken the lead out of the three local authorities in terms of you know, all the information submitted to this examination. And I think, Mr. Gould and I would just like to note our appreciation for always meeting the deadlines. Mr. Stempfer, you've got, and Mr. Humphreys have got hands up. I'll take Mr. Stempfer.
Sorry, Mr. Jones, just before you move on, also I'd like to express my appreciation to the effort that Surrey have put in. When we issued our third written questions, and for that matter our fourth written question, they were quite onerous, but they were onerous because we had to postpone the hearings in March. There was quite a lot of stuff that we would have dealt with at those hearings. And the only real opportunity that we felt at that stage to address matters was through questions, because at that stage, as far as the inspectorate was concerned, it was very uncertain as to whether or not we could get a technological solution in place to deal with matters. We knew we had to deal with compulsory acquisition because of the right to be heard. And yeah, it might have appeared that we put a lot of pressure on, but it was because we were having to juggle with a situation where I think none of us really knew where we were going. Thank you, Mr. Jones.
So yes, I think just to add to Mr. Gould before I hand over to Mr. Stemp from Mr. Humphreys, I think it's fair to say we were slightly making it up as we go along on the hoof in terms of what we were going to do when we realised we suddenly couldn't have these March hearings. We knew we had to do the CA hearing. We tried to avoid, because none of us had even tried the technology then. We didn't even know if the technology was going to work as well as it has or not. So I think our approach was to try and do as much as we possibly could in writing, and then do what we really had to do via the virtual sessions. And once again, both the applicant and Surrey County Council and everybody else, for the record, everybody else's flexibility in moving towards the virtual approach has been really much appreciated by us. So I'll hand over to Mr. Stempfer.
Thank you, sir. David Stempfer, Surrey County Council. I think the County Council would just like to express our thanks as well to the Planning Inspectorate, in particular the rigorous approach that you've taken with the hundreds of thousands, it seems, of documents backwards and forwards. We'd particularly like to thank both yourselves and your backroom staff, in particular, setting up these virtual hearings. Going into these hearings, I think there was some consternation amongst the authority how it would work, and from our perspective, it's gone extremely smoothly. I'd just like to thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Stamford. That's nice to hear. And Mr. Humphreys.
Well, so as I sort of completely endorse all those other thanks, but had another rather special one. I really would, sir, like to thank Mr. Shuttleworth. After the March hearings, Mr. Shuttleworth was due to retire. He has actually delayed his retirement so that he could appear at these hearings, and I think he then will retire in a few days' time, having completed this. So on behalf of both myself as the advocate, I could not have done this morning without him, and obviously the whole Highways England team. I would just like to say thank you very much, Mr. Shuttleworth.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. I think on behalf of the examining authority, Mr. Gould and I would like to wish you a long and happy retirement. So in which case, I know we've got 2 more sessions to go. We're almost there, but we've got sessions tomorrow morning. Arrangements conference at 9:30, and we are starting with the RHS at 10 o'clock in the morning. So thank you very much, everybody. It's 27 minutes past 4, and this session is now closed. Thank you.